During World War II, two men stood at the very top of the Allied command structure, Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. To the public, they looked united. In reality, they could not have been more different. Eisenhower was calm, political, and careful. Patton was explosive, fearless, and brutally honest. Patton believed wars were won by speed and aggression. Eisenhower believed wars were won by coordination and restraint. Behind closed doors, their disagreements were constant. Patton openly criticized Allied caution. Eisenhower quietly worried that Patton's temperament could damage the entire war effort. Yet, despite everything, Eisenhower kept Patton in command. Not because Patton was easy to control, but because no one else could do what Patton did on the battlefield. Still, Eisenhower never said that out loud. Not during the war, not after victory, not even when Patton became a legend. Instead, Eisenhower chose silence. And that silence would last until one moment changed everything. By 1943, George S. Patton had become both a weapon and a liability. On the battlefield, his results were undeniable. Entire enemy formations collapsed under his speed. Cities fell faster than Allied planners expected. But away from the front lines, Patton spoke too freely. He criticized delays. He mocked cautious strategies. He warned that hesitation would cost lives later. Every report reached the same desk, that of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood Patton's military value. What troubled him was Patton's unpredictability. One careless sentence could fracture alliances. One emotional decision could undo months of diplomacy. When controversy struck, Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: publicly defend Patton and risk political fallout, or quietly limit him and risk weakening the war effort. Eisenhower chose control. Patton was sidelined, reassigned, and kept under watch, not as punishment, but as protection. Patton knew it. He felt restrained, mistrusted, humiliated. Yet, when the invasion of Europe approached, Eisenhower made a decision few understood. He brought Patton back, not because he trusted him completely, but because when everything was at stake, Eisenhower knew one truth he would never admit aloud. No other general inspired fear in the enemy quite like Patton. Still, Eisenhower said nothing, and Patton, for all his victories, never heard the words he needed most. In early 1944, the Allies prepared for the most dangerous operation of the war. Every move was watched. Every radio signal was analyzed. Every commander mattered. That was when Dwight D. Eisenhower made one of his most calculated decisions. He did not send George S. Patton to the front. Instead, he placed him where he could not fight at all. Patton was assigned to lead a force that barely existed, an army of inflatable tanks, fake camps, and scripted radio traffic. On paper, it looked like humiliation. In reality, it was strategy. Eisenhower understood something few others did. The enemy feared Patton more than any Allied general. Where Patton went, they expected violence, speed, and chaos. So Eisenhower turned Patton into a shadow. Reports of Patton's presence spread quickly. Enemy scouts tracked his army. High command began shifting divisions to face a threat that was never coming. Patton played his role perfectly. He followed orders. He stayed visible. He said nothing. Behind the scenes, he burned with frustration. He knew he could be changing the course of battles instead of commanding illusions. Yet Eisenhower held firm. He needed Patton not as a fighter, but as a symbol. And it worked. When the real invasion struck elsewhere, defenses were thinner. Confusion slowed the response. Hours were lost. Lives were saved. Still, Eisenhower never explained his reasoning to Patton. No praise, no reassurance, only silence. Patton would return to combat later, and he would win again. But he never forgot the weeks he was turned into a ghost. And Eisenhower never forgot how effective that ghost had been. When the illusion was no longer needed, George S. Patton was finally released from the shadows. He returned to real command with the force of a storm. Units moved faster. Orders were sharper. Momentum returned to the front. Patton advanced with relentless pressure, pushing through terrain others hesitated to cross. His troops followed because they believed speed saved lives, and Patton made them believe it. Reports of rapid breakthroughs once again reached Allied headquarters. At the center of them all sat Dwight D. Eisenhower. He read every update carefully. Patton was winning, exactly as expected. But Eisenhower noticed something else. Patton no longer spoke freely. He no longer challenged decisions openly. He followed orders with precision, but without trust. The general who once demanded total freedom now moved within boundaries. Eisenhower had gained control, and in doing so, he sensed he had lost something far more dangerous to lose. Patton fought harder than ever, as if proving a point only he understood. Victories came quickly, but the cost was exhaustion, physical and emotional. Those close to Patton noticed the change. He slept less, he spoke less, he carried the weight of unspoken resentment. Eisenhower, meanwhile, faced a quiet dilemma. He relied on Patton's aggression. He depended on his results. Yet he feared what Patton represented, a commander who could not be molded. So Eisenhower kept his distance. Praise remained private. Approval remained implied, never spoken. Two men bound by necessity, separated by silence. Neither knew how little time remained. By the time the fighting in Europe slowed, George S. Patton found himself in a new kind of battle. There were no front lines anymore, no rapid advances, no clear enemy. Victory had arrived. But for Patton, peace felt like confinement. He spoke openly about the future, about unfinished business, about dangers he believed others were choosing to ignore. His words were sharp. Too sharp for a world desperate to move on. Once again, reports reached Dwight D. Eisenhower. This time they weren't about battlefield success. They were about tone, about perception, about politics. Eisenhower understood the moment they were in. The war had demanded bold commanders. The peace demanded restraint. Patton had never been built for restraint. Quietly, responsibilities were adjusted. Influence narrowed. Decisions moved elsewhere. Patton felt it immediately. The man who had once been unleashed across continents now found himself limited by protocols and appearances. Still, he carried himself like a soldier. He toured units. He encouraged discipline. He spoke of honor and duty. But those closest to him noticed something different. The urgency was gone. The fire was dimmer. The silence heavier. Eisenhower watched from afar. He respected Patton's service. He acknowledged his victories privately. Yet he said nothing publicly. Not because he doubted Patton's greatness, but because he feared how the world would interpret it now. Two generals, bound by history. One moving forward into leadership, the other trapped between war and peace. Neither realized how close they were to the final chapter. In December 1945, George S. Patton was gone. The news spread quickly but quietly. There were no battles to interrupt, no decisions to delay. For the first time since the war began, Patton could no longer complicate anything. That was when something changed. In private conversations, away from microphones and headlines, Dwight D. Eisenhower finally allowed himself to speak freely. He spoke of results, undeniable, unmatched. He spoke of speed that shortened wars instead of prolonging them. He spoke of fear Patton inspired in the enemy long before the first shot was fired. Eisenhower admitted what he had never said while Patton was alive. That Patton was not reckless, he was decisive. That his aggression was not chaos, it was clarity. That many victories attributed to strategy existed only because Patton moved faster than anyone thought possible. Eisenhower also admitted something harder. He had kept Patton at arm's length not because he doubted him, but because he feared him. Feared the consequences of unfiltered honesty. Feared the political cost of brilliance without restraint. Feared that history would struggle to understand a man who refused to soften himself. And so Eisenhower had chosen silence. Not to diminish Patton, but to manage a world that wasn't ready for him. Only after Patton's death did Eisenhower allow himself one final truth: that wars need men like Patton, even when peace does not. That victory often comes from those too dangerous to celebrate openly, and that leadership sometimes means protecting a legacy by never speaking of it at all. By the time Eisenhower would lead a nation, Patton could no longer hear the words he had earned. History, however, eventually did.